The death of critical thinking rarely looks like death at first. It looks like convenience. It looks like speed. It looks like relief. A mind under pressure always wants the shortest path out of discomfort, and modern life has become a factory for shortcuts. We no longer have to hold a thought for long, shape it, test it, doubt it, or endure the discomfort of not knowing. We can ask a machine. We can ask a feed. We can ask a crowd. We can ask a personality with good lighting and a confident voice. And if the answer comes fast enough, it begins to feel like truth. That is the first betrayal, not ignorance, relief. Critical thinking dies the moment the mind decides that effort is too expensive. It dies when people stop wanting reasons and start wanting outcomes. It dies when a question becomes annoying, when ambiguity feels disrespectful, when the hardest part of thought is no longer finding an answer, but tolerating the silence before one appears. Most people do not realize this is happening because the decline does not announce itself as decline. It arrives as efficiency. It arrives as, I do not need to think about this myself. It arrives as, everyone seems to agree. It arrives as, this is what the algorithm keeps showing me, so maybe it matters. And slowly, without a dramatic collapse, the mind begins to atrophy in the very area it once used to survive reality, independent judgment. The modern mind is being trained to outsource its discomfort, and once that habit forms, it spreads. You stop thinking because it feels easier. Then you stop noticing that you stopped thinking. That is the real danger, not stupidity, obedience disguised as ease. And the mechanisms are everywhere. Social media does not just distract the mind, it conditions it. It teaches the brain to prefer stimulation over reflection, reaction over interpretation, affirmation over examination. You are not simply browsing content, you're being trained by repetition, the same emotional loops, the same moral headlines, the same outrage, the same certainty, the same binary choices, the same shallow labels, the same rehearsed opinions. After enough exposure, the mind begins to believe that whatever appears most often must also be most true. That is why echo chambers are so powerful. They do not just isolate information, they isolate doubt, and doubt is where critical thinking lives. Once doubt disappears, the person becomes easier to move, easier to anger, easier to flatter, easier to recruit, easier to frighten, easier to control. That is why groupthink is not just a social problem, it is a psychological sedative. It lets the individual trade the burden of thought for the comfort of belonging. And belonging feels good until it starts demanding silence. At that point, the mind is no longer trying to understand. It is trying not to be expelled. This is where so many smart people become functionally stupid, not because their intelligence vanished, but because their fear of exclusion became stronger than their need for truth. They will repeat ideas they have not inspected. They will defend positions they do not fully understand. They will attack anyone who threatens the tribe's emotional coherence. They will call it morality, identity, progress, empathy, or common sense. But underneath the language is the same old instinct: stay safe by staying aligned. Even therapy language can become part of this collapse when every disagreement becomes trauma, every flaw becomes pathology, every awkward person becomes a narcissist, every hard conversation becomes toxic. Language stops clarifying reality and starts replacing it. The words feel intelligent, they feel informed, they feel serious, but often they are just a moral costume for a mind that has already decided what to see. And once language becomes armor, thought loses its edge. The consequences are brutal because critical thinking is not a luxury. It is how we separate signal from noise. It is how we tell the difference between a real warning and a manufactured panic. It is how we know when we are being manipulated by fear, by status, by tribal loyalty, by convenience, by our own hunger to be right. Without it, the mind becomes vulnerable to everything that offers certainty. That is why people become so easy to program. Give them an enemy and they will feel oriented. Give them a slogan and they will feel stable. Give them a diagnosis and they will feel seen. Give them an algorithm and they will feel guided. But none of that is thinking. Thinking is friction. Thinking is the willingness to sit in uncertainty long enough enough for the false answer to collapse under its own weight. Thinking is not immediate agreement. It is not the fastest reply. It is not the most repeated opinion. It is the lonely discipline of asking, what is actually true here, and refusing to leave the question too early. That loneliness is the price. Critical thinking always costs something. It costs speed. It costs comfort. It costs social ease. It costs the narcotic pleasure of belonging without friction. It costs the childish hope that life will become simpler if we just choose the right side and stay there. But what we lose without it is far worse. We lose proportion. We lose memory. We lose nuance. We lose moral seriousness. We lose the ability to notice when a crowd is becoming dangerous simply because it sounds righteous. We lose the ability to recognize that intelligence is not the same thing as certainty, and that certainty is often the first symptom of a mind that has stopped growing. The death of critical thinking is not only visible in public discourse, it appears in private life too, in the person who no longer asks why they feel the way they feel, in the worker who stops evaluating whether the job is actually meaningful, in the student who stops reading deeply because summaries are easier, in the parent who accepts every loud opinion because the screen said it confidently, in the citizen who mistakes repetition for legitimacy, in the friend who never challenges anything because conflict feels exhausting. Each small surrender looks harmless. Together, they create a culture that can no longer tell the difference between thinking and consuming. And once that happens, a society becomes easy to steer and hard to wake. The way back is not mysterious, it is just difficult. Critical thinking returns wherever the mind relearns how to slow down, wherever someone becomes willing to be bored again, to be alone with a question again, to read something difficult without immediately asking for a summary, to hold a belief loosely enough that it can be tested, to admit uncertainty without humiliation, to value the process more than the performance, to stop outsourcing the shape of reality to the loudest voice in the room. The mind needs friction the way a body needs resistance. It needs to wrestle with language, with evidence, with contradiction, with delay. It needs silence long enough to hear its own assumptions creak. It needs exposure to people who think differently without becoming a threat in the first 5 seconds. It needs the courage to say, I do not know yet, in a world that rewards instant allegiance. And above all, it needs discipline. Not the discipline of slogans, the discipline of attention, the discipline of reading carefully, of checking, of waiting, of comparing, of asking what is omitted, of noticing who benefits from the story, of remembering that a crowd can be wrong with perfect confidence, and that a mind can be free even when it is outnumbered. The death of critical thinking is not inevitable, but its revival will not come from more noise, more outrage, more content, or more certainty. It will come from people who are willing to think when thinking is inconvenient, from people who can tolerate being out of step with the room, from people who understand that the hardest thing in a manipulated world is not finding information, it is preserving the inner space where information can still be judged. That space is the mind, and if it dies, everything else becomes easier to control. But there is another layer to this decline that is even harder to notice because it feels like virtue. Critical thinking does not only die when people become lazy, it also dies when they become too attached. Once a person's identity gets fused to a belief, a movement, a tribe, a political side, a moral language, or even a preferred self-image, thinking starts to feel like betrayal. The person no longer asks, is this true? They ask, what does this mean about me? And the second question is far more dangerous, because now every contradiction becomes an injury, every challenge becomes disrespect, every correction becomes humiliation. The mind stops evaluating reality and starts defending a self. That is when intelligence becomes theatrical. People perform insight instead of pursuing it. They repeat phrases that signal belonging. They adopt opinions that protect their place in the group. They call this conviction, but it is often fear wearing conviction's clothes. And once that happens, the mind becomes almost impossible to move because it is no longer trying to know the world, it is trying to survive it without losing its identity.